There is a document, or rather a series of documents, that have survived the collapse of empires, the burning of libraries, and the simple, slow decay of parchment. They're the writings of men who lived in the 6th century, men who kept detailed records of the world around them, wars, politics, the rise and fall of kings. But in the mid-530s, their attention was pulled away from the affairs of men and fixed on the sky. The Roman historian Procopius, who was in Rome and then Constantinople documenting the military campaigns of the Emperor Justinian, noted something he could not explain. He wrote that during the entire year the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, and that it seemed exceedingly like the sun in eclipse. He specified the time. It was the 10th year of Justinian's reign. This was not a figurative description of a gloomy political atmosphere. It was a literal observation from a man trained to record precise details. Across the Mediterranean, in Constantinople, another official named John the Lydian made a similar entry. He observed that the sun became dim for nearly a whole year and that the fruits were killed at an unseasonable time. These were two separate witnesses in different locations documenting the same impossible phenomenon. But the most detailed account, and perhaps the most troubling, comes from a source usually attributed to John of Ephesus, a Syriac-speaking bishop traveling in Mesopotamia. He described a darkness that lasted not for a year, but for 18 months. He wrote that each day the sun shone for about 4 hours, and that even this light was only a feeble shadow. The fruits, he noted, did not ripen, and the wine tasted like sour grapes. These are not the words of superstitious peasants. These are the records of educated, high-ranking officials and clergymen, all independently verifying that for a period lasting somewhere between 12 and 18 months, the sun had stopped being the sun. The question is not whether something happened. The question is why the historical record has so few answers about what it was. If these accounts existed in isolation, one might dismiss them as local exaggerations or the result of heavy volcanic haze confined to the Mediterranean basin. But when you begin to layer the sources, a pattern emerges that suggests the phenomenon was global and its effects were far more severe than a simple dimming of light. In Mesopotamia, the chronicles attributed to Joshua the Stylite, though written slightly earlier, contain marginalia from later scribes that align with the timeline of 536, noting a plague of locusts followed by a famine so severe that people resorted to eating animal hides and the roots of plants. In China, the Nan Shi, or History of the Southern Dynasties, recorded a year when the sky was yellow with dust and the sound of thunder was absent. A different Chinese chronicle, the Liang Shi, noted that the stars could not be seen during the day, a subtle but telling detail that indicates the atmospheric haze was dense enough to obscure the very fabric of the sky. Across the ocean, in the Andes, archaeologists studying the Moche culture have identified a significant disruption in their society around this same period, marked by a sudden cessation of monumental construction and evidence of extreme drought. Tree ring data from Scandinavia, Ireland, and even the Sierra Nevada in California all show a dramatic narrowing, sometimes the narrowest rings in 4 centuries, indicating a catastrophic failure of growth in the year 536 and the years immediately following. This is where the official explanations begin to feel incomplete. The most common theory, and the one repeated in textbooks, points to a massive volcanic eruption in Iceland or North America that ejected enough ash and sulfur into the stratosphere to create a global dust veil. It is a plausible explanation, and there is some evidence from ice cores in Greenland that shows a spike in sulfate deposits around this time. But a single volcanic eruption, even a colossal one, typically causes a dimming that lasts 1 to 2 years, not 18 months, and the effects are usually regional, not simultaneous across China, Europe, and the Americas. Something about that timeline deserves a closer look.
The accounts from John of Ephesus do not describe a normal volcanic haze. He wrote that the sun was so obscured that people did not know whether it was the middle of the day or the fourth hour, and that the shadows of people did not appear clearly on the ground. This detail, the absence of shadows, kept appearing in multiple records as I studied them. It suggests a density of particulate matter that goes beyond what volcanologists normally associate with an eruption. And then there is the question of what followed. In 541, just as the sun was beginning to return to its normal brightness, the plague that would bear Justinian's name arrived in the port of Pelusium in Egypt. From there, it spread to Alexandria and then to Constantinople, where at its peak, Procopius recorded that 10,000 people were dying each day. The pandemic would go on to kill perhaps half the population of the Roman Empire, and it would fundamentally reshape the Mediterranean world, contributing directly to the empire's inability to hold its western territories and paving the way for the medieval period. The standard narrative treats the eruption and the plague as two separate, tragic coincidences. But when you place them side by side, the timeline raises an uncomfortable question. The famine and crop failure caused by the 18 months of darkness did not just starve people, it weakened entire populations, disrupting trade, overcrowding cities with refugees, and creating the precise conditions for a bacterial pandemic to explode. The dim sun and the plague may not be separate events. They may be the first and second act of a single larger catastrophe that history has chosen to remember in fragments. The more you examine the decades following 536, the more you begin to see a world struggling to function under conditions it did not understand and could not control. In Britain, the chronicles fall almost silent. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle, usually so meticulous about kings and battles, records nothing of note for a 15-year period beginning around 535. Archaeologists digging at sites from this era have noted the disappearance of imported goods, the cessation of coin minting, and the abandonment of entire villages. The prosperous Romano-British culture that had survived the withdrawal of Roman legions a century earlier seems to have simply collapsed. In Scandinavia, the evidence is even starker. Burials become simpler, grave goods vanish, and the proselytion appears to have dropped precipitously. Some scholars have connected this to the Great Migration of the Goths and the Lombards, suggesting that entire tribes moved south not for conquest, but simply because the land could no longer support them. The Norse sagas, written down centuries later, contain faint echoes of this time, stories of the Fimbulwinter, the great winter that precedes Ragnarok, when the sun and moon are devoured by wolves and the world is plunged into darkness. It is impossible to say with certainty that these myths are memories of 536, but the coincidence is striking. In the Near East, the city of Petra, the magnificent capital of the Nabateans, was largely abandoned around this time, its water management systems failing, its trade routes collapsing. The archaeological record shows a layer of ash and abandonment that aligns precisely with the plague years. What stands out when you compare the numbers is the scale of demographic collapse. Recent studies estimate that the Eurasian landmass may have lost between 30 and 50% of its population between 536 and 550. This is a die-off comparable to the Black Death, yet the Black Death occupies hundreds of books, documentaries, and university courses, and the events of the 530s remain a footnote, a curious anomaly mentioned only in passing. The difference may lie in the nature of the sources. The Black Death was witnessed by a Europe that had a literate, clerical class producing thousands of documents. The catastrophe of the 6th century happened at the tail end of the ancient world, on the threshold of the so-called Dark Ages. Many of the records that once existed have simply been lost. The question becomes, what else might those lost records have contained? Procopius also wrote a secret history, a scandalous account of Justinian and his court that he never intended for public eyes. It survived by chance, a single manuscript discovered in the Vatican Library centuries later. If that one document survived, how many others did not? Somewhere, in a monastery that was sacked, in a library that burned, in an archive that was deliberately cleared to make room for newer records, there may have been a fuller account. A report from a merchant who traveled east, who saw the source of the dust. A letter from an official in Gaul describing the exact color and composition of the substance that fell from the sky. A census from a city in Egypt that recorded the names of the dead and the dates of their passing, allowing us to trace the precise path of the plague as it followed the grain ships. These documents are almost certainly gone, but the pattern they would have revealed remains, embedded in the tree rings, the ice cores, and in the fragments that did survive. The truth of what happened when the sun disappeared for 18 months is not entirely lost. It is scattered, waiting to be reassembled by someone willing to look at the records that were left behind and ask the questions